Hello, Economics 151 students. This week's lesson 8, deals with aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we're going to start with aggregate demand. To understand how it's derived, you start with the aggregate expenditures schedule that we've looked at before. And as you can see, at different levels of the aggregate expenditure schedule, you have different levels of equilibrium. And each of those equilibrium points corresponds with a point on the aggregate demand curve, which is the representation of the relationship between price, or the price level, since we're dealing with aggregates here, and real domestic product, GDP, which is income. So price and income, which on the national level, income is aggregated as GDP. So this is how it's derived. So to practice this a little bit, because how you're going to be asked to understand it on quizzes, is understanding how an increase in investment spending will cause higher expected rates of return. If you remember how we deal with the aggregate expenditures model, it's going to cause the aggregate expenditures curve to do what? And what will that mean for the aggregate demand curve? So go back to the model we were looking at before, and you should be able to see how, in this case, as aggregate expenditures change, you have change in aggregate demand. So you can see that movement from one place to another. In this case, it shifted upward. So an increase in aggregate expenditures is what you would expect. And what that causes is the new equilibrium to be at a point here rather than the original equilibrium. So we have AE1, it shifts upward caused by that change in investment. And so the new equilibrium point then is here at this point, which corresponds to a new aggregate demand curve. So the answer to the practice then is that increase in investment spending causes the aggregate expenditures curve to shift upward like we just saw, and that shifts the aggregate demand curve because it corresponds to that to the right. So just a quick look at that again. Shifts the aggregate expenditures upward, aggregate demand curve then shifts to the right, to that new level of GDP at the same price level. To define aggregate demand, you can imagine what the word aggregate means in this context. It means add it all together. So by definition then, aggregate demand is all of the goods and services that buyers are willing and able to purchase at the various price levels. So when we aggregate it, we're looking at the demand for everything by everyone. So it's kind of a big concept. Just like with demand, there's an inverse relationship between price and aggregate demand, or demand quantities. So here you have the inverse relationship because we're aggregating between the price level and real GDP. So if the price level increases, then real GDP falls. That's what an inverse relationship is. And the reverse is true. If the price level decreases, then real GDP demanded will increase or rise. To see this graphically, here's our aggregate demand curve showing that inverse relationship between the price level and real domestic output, or our GDP. We can see that our definition here is telling us that we have that inverse relationship. It's the demand by businesses, consumers, government, and foreign countries. And that inverse relationship should make sense, just like with the demand curve. As price goes up, the willingness and ability to purchase or produce, in this case, goes down, and vice versa. So aggregate demand can also be defined with that identity we used before for GDP, which is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, because aggregate demand represents all of those sectors of the economy together. What doesn't shift the curve here is going to be a change in price. And that's an important thing to remember when we're talking about shifting the demand curve, the supply curve, the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate supply curve. Price is never a shifter. Price is one of the two variables that we consider when we're looking at it. So it will not shift the curve. It will only move to a new place along the curve if we have a price change. So if I have a price change from here to here, say, all that's going to do is move me along the curve to a new point. To explain why aggregate demand is downward sloping, we have three effects. And it's important to understand how these overlap and partially explain, each one of them partially explains that downward sloping shape to the aggregate demand curve. The first one is called the real balance effect. And what this tells us is that higher price levels reduce the purchasing power of money. And because of that, the quantity of expenditures is going to decrease. So it's as simple as purchasing power being diminished by higher prices. And then the reverse is true. Lower price levels increase purchasing power and increase expenditures. So an example of that would be the balance in your bank is $50,000, but inflation, diminishes the purchasing power. You're going to reduce your spending as a result, and it's the same thing with aggregate demand. So if the price level goes up, which is essentially the same thing as saying that you have inflation, then GDP demanded goes down. Another explanation, and these somewhat overlap and partially explain it together, is the interest rate effect. And the interest rate effect tells us that when the price level increases, demand for money increases, lenders then will need to charge higher interest rates to get a real return on their loans. They'll have to charge that inflation premium. And so price levels increase, and now you're having higher interest rates on loans. And the higher interest rates discourage consumer spending and business investment, which, if you remember, is part of that C plus I plus G plus net exports. And so you have that inverse relationship. Price levels go up, and the aggregate demand, which is those four parts together, two parts of that diminish as a result, because the higher interest rates bring down consumer spending and business investment. And if you remember why, we talked about this a few chapters ago, that consumer spending, well, if you're borrowing the money to do spending, higher rates are going to cause you to spend less of borrowed money. And business investment has a direct relationship to the interest rate. It actually has an inverse relationship, but it's directly related to the real interest rate. And what will happen is if it costs businesses more to make these investments because they're paying higher interest rates, they're going to make less of them. So the C and the I of that total equation are going to be diminished by these higher interest rates. So an example here would be an increase in prices leading to an increase in the interest rate. And you, whether you're a consumer or an investor, are going to be less likely to take out loans to improve your business. If you're an investor, or even if you're a consumer, you're going to be less likely to take out loans to purchase things. So you have the result is that when the price level goes up, GDP demanded goes down. So remember, these three things are explaining that inverse relationship between the price level and real GDP. So here's a interesting graphic that shows you how interest rates and inflation, meaning price level changes, have moved together largely over the last decades and has continued since the early 2000s as well. So it's a very well-established pattern that they move at the same rate. The third explanation of that downward sloping aggregate demand curve is the foreign purchases effect. And so the explanation here is that when our price level rises, foreign buyers are going to purchase fewer U.S. goods, and Americans buy more foreign goods as a result. If you remember, part of that equation for aggregate demand is net exports. And net exports is exports minus imports. So if exports go down and imports go up, then you can see that net exports portion of the equation is going to be reduced. So price levels rise and net exports, or GDP in general, decreases. So for example, if prices triple in the U.S., so we have increasing price levels, Canada is going to buy much less of U.S. goods, much fewer U.S. goods, causing the quantity demanded of U.S. products to fall, That would be our exports. And then we are also in turn going to be buying more imported goods because relative to our goods, they're cheaper. And so here you have that relationship. Price level goes up and GDP demanded goes down because that net exports figure is part of GDP. The shifters of aggregate demand are the equation you see here, C, I, G, and Xn sub n. And these are going to be your shifters. Any change in any one of these is going to shift the entire function. So here's our aggregate demand curve. And just to be clear, a change in the price level will not shift that aggregate demand curve. It will just move us to a new point along the curve. However, a change in any one of these variables that makes up aggregate demand will shift the curve. So an increase in spending will shift aggregate demand to the right because this is consumer spending. And just as a reminder, consumer spending is the largest portion of this equation. It consumes about, or makes up about 70% of it. So consumer spending is the largest portion. Investment is an essential part of it. It doesn't mean that it's not important. There's no possible way to diminish the importance of investment spending because investment is what spurs growth in business and creates jobs. But just numerically speaking, the consumption is the largest portion of aggregate demand. So a change in spending, then consumer spending would shift aggregate demand to the right if it's an increase. And if it's a decrease in aggregate, or in consumer spending, I should say, it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So that's one way that it shifts. So here are the four totals. We just looked at the first one, but there are others. The first one is the change in consumer spending. We just looked at that. Now this can come from a number of different places. One of the effects that will change this is consumers' wealth or their perception of wealth. So a change in the stock market will often change the perception of wealth, and that will trigger a change in consumer spending. Consumer expectations are also a big part of this. If people fear a recession, then their consumer spending is likely to decrease. And if they have confidence or optimism in the future, they're more likely to be willing to spend. And that's why we get constant reports in the economy about consumer confidence. We hear these numbers a lot because it matters as far as what's going to happen today with consumer spending and aggregate demand. Household indebtedness is a part of what determines consumer spending. Households that hold more consumer debt tend to be more careful about their consumer spending, even though it doesn't seem like they would be. That's a pretty typical thing, that the more consumer debt held, the less likely a household is to spend currently. And so they're going to decrease aggregate demand as consumption goes down. Taxes are going to have an effect. And just so you know, if you're looking at this in the video version, the decrease in income taxes, it's underlined and it's in red. I did that to show you the relationship to test questions that you might expect to see, or quiz questions. I want you to understand that these are kind of the highlights, and even though it's part of the bigger picture, it's important to know specifics. And so this one, you'll need to know what happens when there's a decrease in income taxes and how that might affect consumer spending. And as you can imagine, that one would have a positive effect on consumer spending. A decrease in income taxes puts more money in the pockets of consumers, more of their own money, and therefore consumer spending is likely to increase, which is going to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right for an increase. Changes in investment spending, again, this is the I portion of that equation. They're also going to have an effect on aggregate demand. So things like the real interest rates, which is the rate of borrowing or the price of borrowing money for investment, will have an effect. So if interest rates increase, then that raises the price of borrowing money. Investors are going to be less likely to borrow money to make investment. Therefore, investment will decrease. That would lower aggregate demand. If interest rates decrease, then you'd have the opposite effect. It's cheaper to borrow money. there's going to be more investment and an increase in aggregate demand. Future business expectations are going to have an effect here. And if we have high expectations for the future, that's going to increase the willingness to invest, and that would increase aggregate demand. Productivity and technology would also have a positive effect on aggregate demand as investment is more likely to happen. Business taxes, depending on which direction they go, higher corporate taxes is going to be less investment because there's less money in the pockets of investors to put towards business. And the reverse is true, of course. The third part of that equation is G for government expenditures. So a war will boost aggregate demand. And I don't know if you caught this in the music videos from last week, but they talk about that quite a bit. And they acknowledge that war does boost aggregate demand. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is a different question, but they do mention it. Nationalized health care also is an increase in government spending, which is going to increase aggregate demand. A decrease in defense spending is going to decrease that G portion of the equation and therefore decrease aggregate demand. And all of this is important because as we're going forward from here, we're going to start to look at policy effects. And if we understand what the changes are, then when we look at policies, we can do some analysis that makes sense. Because right now you may look at government spending decisions and think, well, all they need to do is stop spending. But once you understand that the decrease in spending actually will shift aggregate demand to the left, then you might get a little better perspective on what policy effects there are and what good and bad policy looks like. The fourth shifter is the change in net exports, which is that X sub N, or X exports minus imports. And those are the notations right here. This is exports. M is notation for imports. So things that will change net exports, and this is an important thing to understand, because exports are the goods that we sell to other countries. And imports, of course, are the goods that we buy from other countries. And so these are affected by changes in our currency value. Because what happens is when somebody wants to buy an American good and they're in another country, really what they have to do first is buy dollars. They have to convert their currency to dollars before they can buy the American products. So if the dollars are cheaper, they're going to buy more of our products. But if the dollars are more expensive, then they're going to buy fewer. So here's the next thing to understand. If the US dollar appreciates, that means the dollar is more expensive. So relative to the euro or any other currency we're looking at. If dollars are more expensive for people in other countries to buy, then you can imagine they're going to buy fewer of our goods. And that's actually going to reduce our net exports. So all of this talk for many years about the weak dollar, what was not said about that and what was good about it was that a cheap dollar internationally means that we have higher net exports. So in a weird way, the weak US dollar for many years has supported us while we kept our net exports figure as high as it could be. It was still a negative, so there was still a trade deficit, but it would have been much worse had we had a stronger dollar. So a strong dollar, oddly enough, reduces net exports, and it matters. Another thing that will affect our change in net exports is our national income compared to income in other countries. So if, if a major importer, somebody that we export to, has a recession, then that's going to be bad for our exports because there's somebody that buys a lot of our goods. Well, they're having a recession. So their monetary situation is going to affect their ability to buy our goods. And again, that creates a problem for us. So we are connected to other countries through their economic situation. If the United States has a recession, then we're buying fewer goods from other countries. And oddly enough, that actually improves our net export situation. But there's an important phrase here, and I want everyone to understand this, because we are all interdependent. In an international economy or global economy, it's an important thing to understand that we really do deal with other nations. Now, individuals do the trading, and nations don't trade, individuals trade. However, on the national level, when we're aggregating all of this information, it's important to recognize that we're interdependent. So here's the phrase, if the US gets a cold, Canada gets pneumonia, because what affects us affects our trading partners much more strongly. And by the way, Canada is our #1 trading partner, just so you know. So here's our just equation, again, just restated. Aggregate demand, rather, is the same as GDP, which is this identity, this formula that we aggregate all of this expenditure to get GDP and aggregate demand. So aggregate supply then is the other side of the aggregated market. It's the amount of goods and services that firms will produce in an economy at different price levels. So this is also real GDP. Because remember, with GDP, we use two methods of calculating it. We use the expenditures method, which we just looked at for demand, which is C plus I plus G plus net exports. And we use the income approach for the aggregate supply side of it, which is payments to the various resources. So aggregate supply then is defined as supply for everything by all firms. And it differentiates between short run and long run. And so there are two aggregate supply curves that we'll look at. Really, there are three, but we'll mainly focus on two of them. And it's important to understand the difference. Short run aggregate supply, just by definition, tells us that in the short run, in the not quite immediate, but in the very near future, we're not going to experience wage and resource prices as the price level increases. And this is also known as sticky prices or sticky wages. What this means for producers is that if the price level rises, they can rush out there and take advantage of the higher price level, sell the product at a higher price without having to pay corresponding higher prices in wages and resource costs, so that they will benefit from that higher price level. So a short-run aggregate supply curve is the upward sloping supply curve we've seen before, because as the price rises, sellers are incentivized to produce more in the marketplace, because in the short run, it is assumed that the wages and resource prices won't keep up very quickly with it. So they can jump out ahead of it, sell it at the higher prices without having to pay more for production. Long-run aggregate supply is a different scenario, and that says that in the long run, wages and resource prices will increase as price levels increase. So that's why we call it sticky in the short run, because it's not a permanent holding down of resource and wage costs, but it is a temporarily sticky situation, and over time, there will be an opportunity for those prices or those costs to increase. The immediate short-run aggregate supply curve, as you can see here, is a horizontal line, because the assumption is that in the immediate short run, the price level is not going to increase as production increases. So you can see here you're moving along. As real GDP increases, the price level is going to hold steady in the immediate short run. That's another indicator of that sticky wage and price situation. However, as we go into the short run, we look at that sticky wage situation, which means that you can produce more. Individual producers, of course, we're aggregating this. Individual producers can produce more, and they're incentivized by that rising price level because they're actually getting out into the market ahead of the corresponding rise in prices for their own costs that is going to come later. That sticky wages idea. In the long run, of course, we have a different situation. In the long run, aggregate supply, we assume that as the output will stay the same as the price level rises, because those wages, those costs of producing will keep up and catch up with the suppliers. So we'll look at all this together. So let's look again at short-run aggregate supply. And again, the idea is that wages and resource prices are not going to increase at the same time the price level increases. So what happens is a firm can make 100 units, this is just an example, that are sold for $1 each, and their only cost is $80 for labor. So that's just an assumption we'll make for this. And we can see that they'll make profit, and they'll make a profit of $20. In the short run, if the price level were to double, and the assumption is that the wages are going to stay the same, so they can now sell those 100 units for the new higher price. They have total revenue of $200, and they still only have the $80 cost of labor. So the profit now, instead of being only $20, is going to be $120. They're able to take advantage of the higher price without experiencing what will later catch up with them, but for now, they have no increase in their production costs. So with higher profits, then the firm has the incentive to increase production. So the aggregate supply curve then looks like this. And aggregate supply is the production of the firms in the economy. Now going to the long run aggregate supply, in the long run we understand that wages and resource prices will increase. They will catch up with those rising price levels. So here's an example to kind of clarify that. The firm has total revenue of $100, uses $80 worth of labor, same example as before, a profit of $20. Now in the long run, you have a similar scenario. You've got the doubled production. You've made twice as many shirts, but now the workers are going to demand higher wages to match those higher prices because they're going to want cost of living adjustment. So your labor costs double as well. And now you have a profit of $40, but you've made twice as many shirts. So your real profit figure hasn't changed. And so if the real profit doesn't change, then for a firm, there's no incentive to increase output and to make more. So you're going to have that vertical aggregate supply curve. So in the long run, this is what your aggregate supply curve looks like. The price level increases, but GDP does not, because the firms don't have an incentive to make more as the price goes up, because they're going to end up bearing the costs of that increased production, and it doesn't incentivize them. Now, another thing that we call the long run aggregate supply curve is we call it the full employment line, or a trend line is another word for it. We call it full employment because it represents full employment of all of the economy's resources. So sometimes you'll see this QY here represented as Q star, but it means the same thing. It means that if we're utilizing all of our resources effectively, this is full employment production. So we also assume that in the long run, the economy is efficient and will be producing at full employment. So that's another assumption of the long run aggregate supply. To understand the shifters of the aggregate supply curve, I use a little acronym, IRAP. Here we go. There are 4 shifters. Just to be clear, an increase in the price level will not shift the curve. It will only move along the curve. But here are the shifters. An increase or decrease in national production is going to shift the curve either right or left. So when we talk about shifting, we're talking about a change in GDP, which is national production. And so here's an increase in national production, and we haven't talked about the shifters yet. I just want you to see this. That shift to the right is an increase in aggregate supply, and that shift to the left is a decrease in aggregate supply. So here are the shifters. The first one is a change in expected inflation. And this is an important one to understand. People respond to their expectations about what they think the future is going to bring, particularly when it comes to inflation. So if an increase in aggregate demand leads people to expect even more high prices in the future, or even higher prices in the future, you're going to have inflationary expectations. So this was going to increase labor and resource costs and decrease aggregate supply. If people expect lower prices in the future, then this is going to have the reverse effect. This is going to decrease labor and resource costs and increase aggregate supply. So it has the opposite effect. The second shifter of aggregate supply is the change in resource prices. So the prices of domestic and imported resources, and this would be land, labor, capital resources. So if we have an increase in the price of Canadian lumber, then we're going to have a decrease in aggregate supply because it increases the costs. If we have a decrease in the price of domestic steel, then you can imagine we're going to have an increase in aggregate supply because now we have lower costs for production and it's going to increase the amount that we produce. Supply shocks can be a part of the change in resource prices. They can cause shocks to the system and raise resource prices dramatically. We've seen that happen in the past, not recently, but in the distant past with oil and things like that. So a negative supply shock where something becomes suddenly unavailable, let's say there's a war and something becomes unavailable, is going to have a dramatic effect on resource prices and shift aggregate supply to the left for a decrease. A positive supply shock will do the opposite. The third one is a change in the actions of government. And so this is not the same as government spending. It's important to understand this is not the C plus I plus G plus X. This is actions of government that affect businesses. So primarily taxes and subsidies. So the first one would be taxes on producers. And if corporate taxes are increased, you can probably make the common sense leap here that people are going to have less money to spend on their businesses. Aggregate supply will decrease. And subsidies for domestic producers will increase aggregate supply. If those subsidies are taken away, that would cause a decrease. So lower subsidies for domestic farmers is going to actually decrease aggregate supply because the subsidies that are in place then are lessened or lowered. Government regulations are actions of the government that can affect aggregate supply because if they stand in the way of a business doing what they do, they can actually decrease how much they're able to produce. So if EPA inspections are required to operate a farm, this kind of government regulation would decrease aggregate supply. The fourth shifter would be a change in productivity. And this is mainly affected by technology. If you had somehow a computer virus that destroyed computers and made technology less available, you'd have a decrease in productivity and a decrease in aggregate supply. Typically, however, technology works in the other direction and actually improves productivity. So let's say we had the advent of a teleportation machine that would allow you to be in two places at one time, then you could have an increase in productivity and an increase in aggregate supply. So some practice here with identifying the shifters of each one. And I'll let you work through this as you want. You can pause the video and make sure you understand which shifter goes with which line, aggregate demand or aggregate supply, and then which direction it's going to go for an increase or a decrease. So I'll let you work through that. And then here are your answers to each of those. And again, you can pause the video and consider how that matched up with yours. Now, the long run aggregate supply curve can actually shift as well. And there are only a few things that will shift that curve, and that is that vertical line. Technology changes will shift the entire ability of the economy to produce. The levels of labor that are present in the economy and the levels of capital. So the presence of labor, and by levels we mean generally skilled labor, trained labor, labor that is, developed human capital. And then levels of capital, the tools of production. Those will definitely have an effect on how much an economy can produce. And so as labor and capital levels increase, technology increases, and this generally leads to the growth of long-run aggregate supply. Because again, I said labor is typically knowledge and educated labor. And so with that increase is going to come greater technology. So it kind of creates a closed loop of increase. So we put them together to find equilibrium price level and output. Just like we did in the market system, we put aggregate demand and supply together. A little bit of practice for you. And if I give you some information about an economy, a hypothetical economy, if I tell you how much is demanded and how much is supplied, it should be a fairly simple thing to find the equilibrium price level here. It's where demand is equal to supply. So the equilibrium price level you should be able to see from the chart. And the second part of this question, I don't know if you can see it very well, it says a worsening of business expectations would cause the real output blank to fall. So I just want you to think about that for a moment. If there were worsened business expectations, what would happen? Would demand fall or supply? Real output supply. So I'll give you a moment, and then you can check your answers. The equilibrium price level would be $200, and business expectations is a shifter of the aggregate demand curve. So this would cause the real output demanded to fall. Here I have some graphing practice for you. I want you to think about how you could illustrate this situation. And so I would encourage you to try to draw this so you can visualize it. If aggregate demand decreases, and as a result, real output and employment decline, which would go along with that. However, the price level remains unchanged. See if you can draw that and then explain how that would be possible. So I'm going to give you a moment. So shift that aggregate demand curve to the left, and that should show a decline in real output and employment. But if the price level is the same, then what's going to happen there? So here's a picture of it. Aggregate demand decreases, and as you can see, when aggregate demand decreases, real output and employment decline, right? Because here's real output and employment. And that's measured here, so that declines. However, the price level remained the same. And so that's going to be a little bit tricky, because if you just have that aggregate demand shifting, then you have the price level going down too. But if I tell you that the price level is going to stay the same, then the only thing that could explain that is that aggregate supply is also decreasing, and you have a recession that's beginning because there's inflexible downward price levels. So normally they would go down, but the assumption here is that we have an inflexible downward price level. It's not going to happen. So the only thing that could explain that price level remaining the same then is a decrease in aggregate supply, which is also the beginning of a recession generally. Another practice with the graphing, and that is to graphically explain this and then explain in words what's happening with the price level. So if I ask you to show me what it looks like with aggregate demand increases and aggregate supply decreases, let's assume they're happening at the same time, the result would be, and you can check yours against this. So here's aggregate demand increasing. That curve is shifting to the right. And then you have aggregate supply decreasing at the same time. So I'm going to go to the point where my new aggregate demand curve and my new aggregate supply curve intersect. Here's my quantity. And so my real GDP has increased a bit. But what I know for sure is that my price level is going to increase. Depending on the degree of the shift here, my quantity could actually either increase or decrease. It really depends on where I put my line. But what I do know is that for sure my price level is going to increase. There's no doubt about that. So graphing this and practicing it and seeing it in action is very helpful. A word about inflationary and recessionary gaps. The idea that we've seen these before, but we saw them in the context of the business cycle. We said when actual GDP is above natural unemployment, or what we call full potential GDP, then we have inflationary pressure on the economy. And when we said that actual GDP is below that trend line, or that natural rate of unemployment, or we also called it potential GDP, when it's below that, we called that a recessionary gap, because it puts recessionary pressure on the economy as employment and GDP slow down. And so recessionary pressure is there as the economy slows down. So we can see the same concept in the model that we're looking at today, which is this aggregate demand and supply model. So assuming that the government increases spending, we can evaluate this model to see what happens to the price level and output. So here we've got long-run aggregate supply. This is full employment, so this is potential GDP. And we've got our aggregate demand curve and supply curve, and they intersect right here, and all is well in the economy. But let's introduce a change. So let's say that the government increases spending. That's going to increase the aggregate demand curve, shift it to the right. And now we've got an equilibrium point that is beyond long-run aggregate supply. So we are now producing, our GDP is in excess of our potential GDP. So you should recognize this a little bit from our earlier model with the business, or earlier example with the business model. And now we have inflationary pressure on the economy because now we're producing more than we're buying, and this is going to have people competing for those things, and it's going to raise prices, and this is that inflationary pressure. So we call the distance between what we could produce or what we're buying and what we're producing, we call this inflationary. This gap is an inflationary gap because it puts inflationary pressure on the economy. So here's the gap. Again, just seeing it here. Output is high, and unemployment is less than the natural rate of unemployment, because if we're producing here, and this is also the natural rate of unemployment, so to tie it back into that business model, if we're beyond this, we're producing out here, then we're below the natural rate of unemployment. So again, output is high, unemployment is low, and it's good, but it does put inflationary pressure on the economy. So our actual GDP is above potential GDP. Here's another example. Let's assume that we're back in that equilibrium point and everything's good and we're at potential GDP here. And assume that the price of oil increases dramatically for whatever reason. Let's say there's a supply shock or a war or something like that. So what's going to happen to price level and output? Well, we can see that the price of oil is a major input in the economy. Most things that are produced rely in some way on the presence of oil. So we're going to expect that the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, and that will bring the price level up, and it will also bring production down, which is an interesting condition that we call stagflation, because we have inflation with the price level going up, but we also have an economy that's slowing down. So this is a condition that we experienced in the 70s with the oil shocks of the 70s, and we gave it the name of stagflation. We don't see much of it today, but this is a condition that you should be aware of and understand that this is a recessionary gap, which is kind of a weird condition because it has inflation as well as the recessionary gap. It's kind of an interesting hybrid. But the gap itself, just so you see, is the distance between what we should be producing, because this is full employment right here, and what we are actually producing. So the quantity of our GDP is below what we're potentially able to produce if we're being efficient with our resources. So we have this area here is our recessionary gap. In the short run and the long run, shifts in aggregate demand and supply change the price level and output in the short run, just to give an example of that. So let's assume that consumers increase their spending, and we can evaluate that graphically. And if we understand that consumption is part of aggregate demand, because it's the C portion of that equation, then we can expect that aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. And what happens to the price level? I want you to go ahead and just take a look at that and do some analysis. You should be able to see pretty easily that the price level is going to rise and output is going to increase as well. And we're going to call that an inflationary gap because, again, this is going to put inflationary pressures on the economy. And as you can see, when the price level rises, that's our definition of inflation. So there's that. Now, in the long run from this scenario, this is the important part. In the long run, you're going to have some things that change, because inflation is going to mean that workers are going to seek those higher wages. So we're going to go to that picture where now the costs of production are going to catch up with producers. So eventually workers will try to adjust their contracts and do things like that to get higher wages to compensate them for the inflationary pressures. And that's going to cause aggregate supply to shift to the left. And we come back to a new equilibrium where we don't have an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap. However, what we do have, as you can see, is a higher price level. And so this is an important thing to understand, that in the short run, you have changes. But in the long run, those changes do correct themselves. However, they leave you with a higher price level as the economy is adjusting to get back to that equilibrium point. So you're back to full employment with a higher price level. And let's look at another short run scenario that goes to the long run. Consumer expectations fall and consumer spending plummets because people don't feel confident in the economy. So what's going to happen in the short run and the long run? So in the short run, we can imagine that aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. So here's that shift. The price level falls as a result. And so you've got that decrease in price and quantity. We are below long-run aggregate supply. And we've got that recessionary pressure on the economy. In the long run, as the workers accept lower wages, because wages work in both directions. As prices go up, workers demand higher wages. As prices come down, workers learn to accept lower wages. And we've seen this pretty recently in the most recent recession in 2008, 2009. Quite a few workers accepted over time reductions in pay. I know that I did as a teacher. We had temporary reductions in pay. And some districts in our area actually renegotiated contracts and brought the wages down permanently. So this does happen. And as that happens, then production costs fall and aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. So you're back in equilibrium, but now you're down at a lower price level. So ultimately what's happening is the price level is adjusting as we get back into equilibrium. And we call this the ratchet effect. And this is an important understanding, because what happens is, as you just saw demonstrated, prices go up, and then when the economy corrects itself, they go up again, or they go down. And when the economy adjusts itself, they go down again. And it builds on itself. So a ratchet works as a one-way device. It goes in one direction only. And so the ratchet effect on the economy is the same idea, that it moves in one direction and one direction only. And once you make a turn, it holds that position, and then you can only go more in the same direction. So, the question about deflation that we just saw, or that situation, you might ask yourself, does this happen very often? And it doesn't, although we can point to some recent examples. It certainly doesn't happen as often historically as inflation does. And the reason is, I think, an easy one to understand, because if prices fall, in order for firms to stay in business, their resource costs have to fall, or they would go out of business and we'd have, just this spiral into death. And, there is a concept in economics about the wage and price spiral, but we're not going to get into that here. But the idea is that the cost of resources, if it would have to fall, however, it rarely does fall. And it has to do with labor contracts, and that is unions, of course, making contracts for their members. And like I said, it was a really rare occasion for the teachers' unions in the last recession to make that kind of concession, to actually renegotiate contracts and accept permanent wage cuts. That was a very unusual situation. And I doubt that they'll do it again, because of what they learned from the last experience, which is that this ratchet effect is long-lasting. Another reason that labor costs rarely fall is because workers have very poor morale when their wages are lowered, especially when it's at a permanent wage reduction. That is devastating to the morale of most workers. And then again, firms have these menu costs where they have to pay to change prices. And this is actually a huge cost for a lot of firms. Imagine a restaurant changing prices. That would be an extremely high cost to them to do it. And so firms don't want to have constantly changing prices. And so where it's easy for most firms to add to their price, to go backwards is pretty costly and doesn't look good for the firm to be kind of vacillating with prices. So these three things have a lot to do with the fact that the cost of resources rarely falls. So just like a ratchet, prices can easily move up because a ratchet moves in one direction, but not down. They don't move down very easily at all. The final part of this is the classical versus Keynesian. So last week you were introduced to the two economists, Hayek, who was a classical economist, and Keynes, Lord Keynes, who was obviously the author of Keynesian economics. And there are different viewpoints on how government policy should intervene in economic matters. So, excuse me, Keynes' theory was developed during the Great Depression when macroeconomics was really developed. The classical theory, however, predated Keynes. And the idea of the classical theory, or the Austrian school, as I know that Hayek mentioned in the video, he said, I'm going to school you in my Austrian perspective. The classical theory said that a change in aggregate demand is not going to change output, even in the short run, because wages and prices are flexible. So a very different viewpoint than the sticky prices viewpoint of Keynes. And so classical theory says that, even in the short run, nothing's going to change. Aggregate demand isn't going to change output because everything is going to adjust at the same time in real time. And aggregate supply is vertical, and so aggregate demand can't increase without causing inflation. So if we see this graphically, we've got that long run aggregate supply curve, and then you've got your aggregate demand curve. And so a change in aggregate demand, let's say it increases, is going to, or let's say it decreases, is not going to change output. You can see that the quantity is the same, and it's going to change the price level. So it can't increase without causing inflation, and it can't decrease without causing deflation. And so the classical theory states that the price will fall eventually. If aggregate demand falls, the price level will fall, and that will actually work itself out as lower prices increase aggregate supply. And if left to its own devices, the government doesn't have to get involved. The economy will correct itself. Same will happen if prices go up. Higher prices will have a different effect on the economy, but either way, it's going to correct itself through the forces of supply and demand within the market system. Now, Keynesian theory is quite different, and I don't want you to focus on the graphical representation because this isn't what we're covering. I just want you to recognize, though, that the Keynesian theory is very different. Keynes believed that there was going to be a persistent recession if we had a decrease in aggregate demand because the price of resources is not flexible. He thought that those wages and resource prices were sticky. And so because of that persistent recession that was going to be caused by it, that the government was going to have to get involved and close that gap with government spending because those sticky wages were going to prevent wages from falling and allowing the economy to correct itself like it would have in the classical model. So I'm going to leave it here, and I hope that you'll take some time with this PowerPoint or with this video and practice the concepts in here. Make sure you understand the difference between the classical and the Keynesian approach, and make sure you're comfortable with these aggregate demand and aggregate supply shifters and the graphical representation of this. All right, good luck.